When a $300 million yacht crushed an old fisherman's boat in broad daylight, no one expected justice. The crowd just watched as a tech billionaire laughed while the wreckage sank. But the next morning, warships filled the harbor, Navy SEALs sealed the docks, and a retired veteran who everyone thought was just a relic became the center of a federal operation. Who was he really? And why did the most powerful arm of the military suddenly bend to a forgotten man with nothing left to lose? The July sun shimmered off the water like broken glass as families crowded the harbor for the annual Sea Fest parade, a picturesque blend of fireworks, music, and floating pageantry. The marina had never looked brighter. Boats of every shape and size lined the edges of the harbor, decorated in flags and streamers, and children waved from decks as if they were riding magic carpets across the waves. No one noticed at first when the glossy white silhouette of a megayacht appeared on the outer horizon. It glided through the water with the arrogance of a creature that believed it owned the sea, dwarfing every other vessel in its path. The harbor master's radio calls went unanswered. The music drowned out the tension. By the time people turned their heads, it was too late. The Marlin, a modest, aged fishing boat adorned with hand-painted Navy emblems, was squarely in the yacht's path, and the yacht wasn't slowing down. A deep, metallic groan split the air as fiberglass met steel. The yacht, later identified as the Aurelius, didn't even break. It cleaved through the side of the Marlin with a force so violent that onlookers dropped their drinks and screamed. The smaller vessel buckled, tipped, and sank within minutes. A man was thrown overboard. Saltwater mixed with fuel. But instead of chaos aboard the Aurelius, there was laughter. Real, guttural laughter. Phone cameras caught champagne flutes clinking on the upper deck and a man in designer sunglasses, later confirmed as tech billionaire Devon Roth, grinning as he pointed at the wreckage. "Should have bought a real boat, old man," someone shouted. There was no apology, no emergency response from the yacht's crew. Just music. Just mockery. And Walter Briggs, the old man in the water, clutching the floating life ring with shaking hands as the last piece of his boat, and his history, disappeared beneath the waves. The videos went viral within hours. Some called it a tragic accident. Others called it a cruel display of class warfare. A few influencers even joked about boomer rage in the comments. But there were those who didn't laugh. Those who watched the man's face as he was pulled ashore, stoic, blooded, silent, and saw something deeper behind the cracked sunglasses and soaked uniform. Something that didn't belong to the past, but to a different kind of power. The town's mayor gave a brief statement of concern but stopped short of placing blame. Insurance adjusters arrived, but their coverage didn't include collision by luxury yacht. Roth's lawyers offered a check that Walter never even looked at. By nightfall, the harbor had gone back to fireworks and celebration. Everyone forgot. Everyone except the man standing alone on the dock, staring out at the dark water, fists clenched around a rusted Navy ring that hadn't left his finger in 40 years. Walter Briggs was not a man prone to complaint or self-pity. He carried himself with the quiet restraint of someone who had seen more than he was ever willing to speak about. In the days that followed the crash, his routine didn't change. He still rose at dawn, poured 2 cups of coffee. One he drank, the other he left steaming on the opposite side of the table, untouched, and walked the perimeter of the marina barefoot, his steps slow but precise. Most people in town knew him only as Captain Briggs, the grizzled veteran with the weathered hands and the old fishing boat painted in fading naval blue. But the story behind that boat, and behind the man himself, was one very few were privy to, and none who knew dared to tell. Walter's life had been defined by service, by loss, and by a mission that had never truly ended. Decades earlier, Walter had commanded one of the Navy's most decorated submarine units during a time of mounting global tension. His strategic genius and unshakable loyalty earned him a reputation within the Pentagon as a man who could be counted on when the world spun too close to chaos. He was the kind of officer who understood sacrifice not as an idea, but as a practice. But for all his accolades, none of them mattered more than the photo he kept folded in his wallet. A picture of his son, Mark, in uniform, taken just a week before Mark deployed for a mission that would never make headlines. Mark had followed in his father's footsteps, enlisting against Walter's wishes, determined to serve not for glory, but for redemption, to fix what generations before him had broken. Walter never said the words out loud, But he blamed himself every day since his son was listed as MIA in a black site operation overseas. The official report said there was a drone malfunction. Walter had read the classified files. He knew better. And the boat, the Marlin, had been Mark's final gift. A vintage fishing vessel, restored with his first paycheck, and given to Walter with a note that simply read, "So you'll keep chasing what matters." It became more than a boat. It became his shrine. His church. His therapy. After retiring from active service, Walter moved to the harbor town, far from Washington and its polished lies. He never spoke of his past. He wore his scars like armor. But the people who had lived there long enough knew to keep their respect quiet and their gratitude sincere. He fixed nets for the younger fishermen. He taught kids how to tie knots and navigate by the stars. And when the anniversary of Mark's disappearance came each year, he took the Marlin out at midnight, dropped a single rose into the ocean, and returned at sunrise without a word. He never missed a year. Until now. In the wake of the crash, reporters knocked on his door. Lawyers called. Social media influencers even offered to tell his story for their channels, some under the guise of empathy, others as clickbait. Walter ignored them all. The boat couldn't be replaced. But what broke something deeper wasn't the loss of the vessel itself, it was the way it happened. The mocking laughter. The careless wealth. The humiliation. He had spent a lifetime in service of a country that now watched him be ridiculed like an antique relic, disposable in the face of modern power. And yet, Walter didn't scream. He didn't rant. He simply gathered the charred remnants of the boat's nameplate from the wreckage and returned home. But something had shifted. That morning, for the first time in years, he didn't leave the second coffee on the table. He poured only one. At the town's edge sat an old naval memorabilia shop run by an amputee named Harris, another vet, younger, but carrying the same haunted eyes. Harris had served under Walter once, and though they rarely spoke, the bond between them ran deeper than blood. The day after the crash, Harris found a strange package on his doorstep. It contained only a photo, a coin, and a code phrase. Command still recognizes Vela. Harris didn't hesitate. He disappeared into the back of the shop, past the shelves of old uniforms and rusted compasses, and entered a room no one but Walter knew existed. It was lined with encrypted radios and communication logs dating back to the Cold War, remnants of a network that never officially shut down. Harris activated a signal. 3 tones, 1 silence. Within the hour, someone in DC received the ping. Walter, meanwhile, stood at the edge of the pier that once moored the Marlin. A folded flag rested under his arm. In his other hand, he held Mark's journal, water-damaged but still legible. He read a passage about honor, underlined 3 times in his son's handwriting. Then, for the first time since the crash, he spoke, not to anyone present, but to the sea itself. "You took what mattered. Let's see if you remember who I was." That night, a coded message went out from a forgotten transmitter on the East Coast. It contained no threats, no accusations. Just one phrase, Echo 1 requests final passage. Only 5 people in the world knew what it meant. All 5 were still alive. And all 5 understood that somewhere, somehow, a reckoning had begun. Devon Roth was no stranger to controversy, but this time he was certain he'd outdone himself. The 38-year-old tech billionaire had built his empire on disruption, first in fintech, then in AI, then in defense contracting, ironically. His public image was a cocktail of brilliance, arrogance, and viral charisma. He thrived on headlines, leaned into backlash, and weaponized infamy as a currency more valuable than Bitcoin. In the hours after the yacht incident, while the local community reeled from the destruction of the veteran's boat, Roth was already spinning the narrative. By the next morning, he posted a photo of himself shirtless on the yacht's deck, drink in hand, captioned, "Old boats sink. That's life. Stay modern." His followers roared with laughter. Influencers reposted it with fire emojis. Even a few late-night talk shows aired the clip of the crash, cutting to the billionaire's quote with sarcastic applause. What no one knew was that Roth was leaning into the joke not just to save face, but to smother something he couldn't quite name, a feeling of discomfort he hadn't expected when he saw the old man's eyes in that viral video. They weren't afraid. They weren't angry. They were waiting. Roth's team advised him to issue a public apology, to offer restitution, or even invite the man onto a podcast for damage control. But Roth dismissed them. "The guy's practically a ghost," he said. "Let it die." Instead, he doubled down, commissioning a crude cartoon video mocking the crash and launching a line of limited edition NFTs of the Marlin sinking, each one tagged with slogans like "Boats don't cry" and "Adapt or drown." Within 24 hours, the collection sold out. Roth's personal assistant tried to mask her disgust. She had grown up in a Navy family. But Roth, immune to the human cost of anything outside his curated bubble, had no time for such sentimentality. That night, he hosted a party aboard Aurelius, now docked in a private slip surrounded by security drones and anti-paparazzi tech. The theme: sink or swim. Guests arrived in nautical wear. Cocktails were served in mini life rafts. A stunt diver even reenacted the sinking, complete with a fog machine and Titanic music playing over the yacht's $1 million sound system. When someone asked if the vet whose boat was destroyed would attend, Roth laughed. "Only if he buys a ticket. I hear GoFundMe's a thing." But something strange happened that evening. Around midnight, as the party reached its peak, the lights along the far end of the harbor flickered. Just a second. Barely noticeable. But it happened again 10 minutes later. Then came the hum. Deep, low, mechanical. Some thought it was the yacht's engine. Others thought it was a nearby powerboat. No one could pinpoint the source. Roth, slightly drunk, wandered to the rail and peered into the darkness. His pupils caught a faint silhouette, not civilian, not commercial. Sleek. Angular. It was gone in a blink, swallowed by the black waves. He shook it off. But the rest of the night, he couldn't relax. The laughter no longer rang as sweet. The drinks felt heavier. And when the final guests left and the yacht slipped into silence, he stood alone on deck, staring at the empty dock across the water where the veteran's boat once Saturday. The next morning, Roth's publicist received an unusual request. It wasn't a lawsuit, not a cease and desist, not a press inquiry. It was a delivery confirmation. A single envelope had been dropped off at Roth's private estate, addressed in handwriting no one could identify. Inside was a photo. A grainy black and white image of a young sailor, Walter Briggs, standing beside a much younger Devon Roth's father, Senator Harold Roth. Behind them was a classified Navy transport vessel, long since retired. The message on the back: "He saved your father's life. Time to return the favor." Roth stared at it for a long time. The senator had died years ago in a plane crash. Devon had idolized him, but they had grown distant in his final years. He never knew much about his father's military past, only that he was once taken hostage and rescued during an operation no one talked about. Roth dismissed the photo as a prank. But he didn't sleep that night. And neither did his security team. By day 3, Roth's narrative began to slip. News outlets began digging into the identity of the man whose boat was sunk. One outlet uncovered Walter's Navy record. Another obtained footage from a town hall meeting a decade earlier where Walter gave a trembling eulogy about fallen soldiers who were buried without headlines. The shift in public sentiment was subtle at first, then sharp. The comment sections turned. Memes mocking Roth were created just as fast as his NFTs had sold. The hashtag #JusticeForBriggs trended. Navy veterans began organizing peaceful rallies along the coast, not in protest, but in silence, full dress uniform, standing on docks with folded flags held at their chests. Roth mocked them at first. Until one night, his yacht security system detected a breach. No footage. Just static. Just silence. The Coast Guard denied responsibility. His drones picked up nothing. But when Roth checked the boat himself, he found a single object left on the bow, an old Navy challenge coin, polished, placed dead center like a warning shot. No fingerprints. No explanation. That morning, Roth called his legal team and asked if it was possible to make this whole thing go away quietly. But it was too late. Something was already in motion. And somewhere in Washington, a classified logbook had been reopened for the first time in 27 years. The name at the top of the page: Captain Walter Briggs. Beside it, a red stamp, Echo 1, Reinstatement approved. The harbor awoke not to the sound of gulls or ferry horns, but to the low rumble of turbines and the unmistakable silhouette of war. Just before dawn, 3 Navy destroyers moved into the bay under a cloak of radio silence, flanked by 2 submarines surfacing in unison like twin leviathans from the deep. A detachment of patrol boats lined the perimeter. Helicopters hovered above the marina, engines slicing the morning fog like blades. Locals stumbled from their homes in robes and slippers, phones in hand, eyes wide with disbelief as military vehicles rolled down streets that had known only bicycles and beer trucks. The town had never seen anything like it. No announcement had been made. No sirens blared. No press conferences were scheduled. The U.S. Navy had arrived without ceremony, without explanation, but with unmistakable authority. They weren't occupying. They were reclaiming. And the world's richest man didn't even know they were coming for him. By 6 a.m., all public access to the harbor had been restricted. The yacht slips were cordoned off by personnel bearing credentials no civilian could interpret. Divers entered the water, attaching sonar devices and scanning beneath every vessel docked within a 3-mile radius. No press was allowed near. Social media exploded with shaky footage of black-clad soldiers rappelling down from helicopters onto the decks of select yachts, confiscating devices, speaking into encrypted radios. The mayor tried to intervene, tried to demand information. He was ignored. When a city council member asked who was in charge, a stern-faced officer replied, "Command reports to command," and walked off. Within the hour, every yacht but one had been boarded, searched, or redirected. The Aurelius, however, was untouched, at least for the moment. Instead, a small unmanned vessel circled it every 15 minutes, equipped with a scanning rig and a surveillance drone tethered to its rear. Roth was still inside, shielded by private security and expensive silence, unaware that his illusion of control had already been shattered. At precisely 7:22, a military transport truck arrived at the far end of the harbor. A ramp lowered. Out stepped Walter Briggs, wearing his full naval dress uniform for the first time in nearly 3 decades. The crowd gasped. He looked taller somehow, more alive. Medals polished, posture sharp, gaze fixed. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. He was flanked by 2 officers in dark suits who addressed him as commander and guided him not toward the chaos, but toward the lead destroyer. A saluting officer waited at the gangway. As Walter ascended, the sailors on deck stood at attention. It was not symbolic. It was not sentimental. It was protocol. The moment his boots hit steel, he was no longer a retired man. He was reinstated. He was Echo 1. Inside the ship's operations center, screens flickered with encrypted feeds. A briefing was underway. Roth's financial activities were being analyzed, his defense contracts re-examined, and his digital infrastructure probed by a joint task force under orders that bypassed even the Secretary of the Navy. This wasn't about the yacht anymore. It was about who Roth had become, a man who had crossed lines so subtly and so often that only someone outside the system could recognize the danger. Walter had warned about men like Roth decades ago. Men who learned just enough about war to exploit it for profit, who used tech not to serve humanity, but to dominate it. This was about accountability. And it was long overdue. Meanwhile, aboard the Aurelius, Roth finally stepped outside, blinking at the sudden movement in the harbor. His phone buzzed with messages he couldn't make sense of. Footage of Walter in uniform was circulating online. Analysts were debating the legality of a private citizen receiving an apparent military escort. Roth called his legal team. No one answered. He activated his yacht's private satellite line. It had been cut. Every attempt to access external networks was rerouted. Frustrated, he turned to his head of security, who now stood motionless, staring toward the destroyer where Walter had just disappeared below deck. "What the hell is happening?" Roth snapped. The man swallowed hard before replying, "I think we're not the ones in charge anymore." Within hours, an unmarked barge arrived. It docked quietly beside the destroyer, its deck covered in steel crates and sealed equipment cases. No one but the highest-ranking officers were allowed near. Intelligence operatives emerged, cross-referencing documents, distributing sealed orders. Beneath the waves, specialized divers conducted a search grid around Roth's yacht, not for explosives, not for threats, but for listening devices, tech signatures, and unauthorized surveillance installations. What they found was never disclosed, but it was enough for an emergency session to be called at the Pentagon. The Aurelius had been a vanity project. But it was also, unintentionally or otherwise, a floating data hub tied into defense systems Roth's companies had helped build. And that made it a matter of national security. Back in town, residents watched from rooftops and balconies, unsure whether to cheer or fear what was unfolding. The air carried the electric tension of justice and unease. Was this vengeance? Was it honor? Or was it something more dangerous? The quiet hand of power reminding everyone who still held the keys. And at the center of it all was Walter Briggs, standing once again not as a victim, but as a commander in a war no one had seen coming. The man who had been laughed at, dismissed, humiliated, now moved within a sphere that dwarfed Roth's billions. And as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the harbor, one thing became clear. Someone had flipped a switch buried deep in the foundation of American command. And Walter was holding the wire. The truth had been buried under decades of red tape, encrypted logs, and forgotten codes. But Walter Briggs had never forgotten the weight of it. His final classified mission had been deemed so volatile that even his retirement papers were stripped of the incident. 35 years ago, while the rest of the country followed Cold War headlines, Walter led a Black Ops operation known only as Echo Fire to extract a high-value prisoner from a rogue facility in Eastern Europe. A senator's son caught between two governments, each pretending he didn't exist. That man was Harold Roth. And the man who bled to get him out was Walter. The mission was never acknowledged publicly. But somewhere in the upper echelons of Washington's defense network, the logs had remained active, dormant, until the phrase Echo 1 requests final passage triggered a sequence of alerts that could not be ignored. Walter hadn't just saved a life. He had, for a brief moment, held the fragile balance of global diplomacy in his hands. Now, that debt was being quietly, forcefully called in. Inside the command room of the USS Anderson, Walter was handed a tablet with real-time surveillance of Devon Roth's communications, financial holdings, and previously hidden data transmissions linked to defense contracts his companies were embedded in. Some of these systems were meant only for use by the military, encrypted targeting protocols, battlefield AI patterns, drone command language. Somehow, Roth's yacht had been piggybacking these networks without formal clearance. Whether it was oversight, corruption, or manipulation didn't matter. The breach was real. And it was being investigated not by civilian courts, but by naval intelligence and black-budget cybersecurity divisions that operated beyond civilian visibility. Walter's reinstatement wasn't ceremonial. He was temporarily granted oversight authority, not to launch a missile, but to interpret Roth's involvement through a national security lens. "You're not just here for justice," one officer had said. "You're here because the system needed someone it still trusted." The Aurelius became the focal point of a multi-agency sweep. What appeared on the surface to be an obnoxious symbol of wealth was, beneath the decks, a complex web of encrypted servers, biometric vaults, and AI cores running proprietary software that should not have existed outside of top-level clearance. Roth had apparently been using his influence in defense circles to model live war simulations from real-time battlefield data. The same data Walter's units had bled to collect over decades of war. The revelation wasn't just damning, it was infuriating. A man who mocked the sacrifice of veterans was actively monetising the information their sacrifices had helped generate. Walter stared at the holographic layout of the yacht systems, his eyes narrowing as he scrolled past each file tagged with red clearance warnings. He saw names of fallen soldiers embedded in code strings, their movements archived, modeled, manipulated. Roth hadn't just sunk the Marlin. He had desecrated the very memory of those it honored. The Navy's response was swift, coordinated, and deliberately invisible. The mission wasn't to arrest Roth in front of cameras. That would make him a martyr in the tech-libertarian echo chambers. The objective was erasure. Quiet and surgical. Over the next 12 hours, offshore digital operatives scrubbed Roth's access to every classified server. Automated legal holds were placed on his defense subsidiaries. A shell company, backed by naval funds, initiated a sudden buyout of one of Roth's smaller firms, exposing previously shielded networks to review. Meanwhile, a civilian analyst embedded in Roth's AI division leaked internal emails showing the mogul had instructed engineers to bend the firewall a little to keep their simulations running in real time. That email, combined with the illegally synced drone command data, was enough. Walter gave no speech. He issued no orders in the traditional sense. He simply walked to the war room console, scanned his thumbprint, and confirmed the final directive. Repurpose target asset under Federal Recovery Authority. A naval term, not destruction, but reclamation. The operation was codenamed Silent Rain. At midnight, Navy SEALs boarded Aurelius under the guise of a routine inspection. Roth, arrogant to the end, tried to record the event, demanding they leave. But the moment the lead operative handed him a sealed envelope, his smirk faded. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing his father's signature, a letter written years before his death, addressed to Walter. "If you're reading this," it said, "then my son has become the very kind of man you swore to stop. Do what must be done. I trust you more than I ever trusted him." Roth's hands trembled as he dropped the letter. No one had to say a word. His private security stood down. His lawyers didn't show up. His calls weren't answered. Power had shifted, and it no longer recognized his voice. Back at the dock, the town watched silently as the Aurelius was towed by naval tugs toward a restricted facility. No press statement was issued. No public arrests were made. The yacht would never be seen again. When reporters asked what had happened, the Navy spokesperson replied with a carefully constructed sentence. "Mr. Roth is cooperating with an internal review regarding unauthorized systems aboard his vessel." That was all. Behind closed doors, Walter signed a sealed deposition, then declined any further participation in the inquiry. His job was done. What came next would be handled by people who still understood that silence could be louder than spectacle. Before leaving the destroyer, he removed his dress uniform and folded it neatly, placing it in a box beside the only thing he took from Roth's ship, the Marlin nameplate, recovered from the yacht's display case, somehow polished and unbroken. In the days that followed the quiet seizure of the Aurelius, the harbor returned to its stillness, but something unspoken hung in the air, like the echo of a thunderclap long after the storm has passed. The Navy ships that once filled the bay withdrew one by one, their silhouettes vanishing over the horizon without fanfare, leaving only ripples in their place. Tourists returned. Fishermen cautiously resumed their routes. The Sea Fest banners, once fluttering over a shattered dock, were taken down and stored away, never to be used again. But for those who had witnessed what unfolded, for those who saw power realign without a single bullet fired, the harbor had changed forever. And at the center of that transformation stood a man who never asked for justice but received something far greater, acknowledgement. Walter Briggs refused any interviews. He turned down every media request, every six-figure book deal, every television offer that promised to make him the face of honor. He didn't want his face on magazines or his words packaged into sound bites. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, was quiet restoration. The Navy offered him a new vessel, cutting-edge, custom-built, with his name etched into the hull. He declined. He didn't want another boat bearing his story. Instead, he asked for something simple, funding to restore the veteran marina that had long fallen into disrepair, the same marina where young sailors once learned to tie their first knots and old soldiers gathered to tell stories that no one else wanted to hear. With the redirected funds from the silent sale of Roth's assets, the Navy agreed. Within weeks, construction began. What rose from the bones of the past was not a memorial but a living tribute, a harbor that would serve those who had served, rebuilt not in stone, but in purpose. Walter named it the Marlin Wharf, in honor of the boat that had been more than wood and metal, a floating memory of his son, and of a time when duty wasn't traded for dollars. The town held a ceremony. No celebrities. No cameras. Just a folded flag, a brass plaque, and the sound of boots on fresh wood. Veterans from across the state came to witness it, many of them unaware of what Walter had done, but all of them understanding, on some instinctual level, that something right had been restored. A young boy approached him after the ceremony, holding a crumpled drawing of a ship. "Is this yours?" he asked. Walter looked at it, saw the crooked little letters that read the Marlin, and smiled. "It used to be," he said. "But now it's yours to remember." Roth, meanwhile, disappeared from public life. No charges were ever officially filed. No subpoenas were made public. He didn't return to social media. His companies continued under new leadership. Names scrubbed, boards restructured, data silenced. To the outside world, it seemed like a billionaire had simply stepped away from the spotlight. But in Washington, behind steel doors and sealed documents, Roth's digital footprint had been effectively reduced to ash. His access revoked. His contracts voided. The systems he once manipulated now ran under different oversight, hardened by the lessons of one man's quiet vengeance. Walter never spoke of what was found on the Aurelius. He never alluded to the truth behind the operation. What mattered was that the harm had stopped, and that it had stopped without bloodshed. Still, not everything returned to peace. Late one evening, as Walter sat alone on the end of the dock, a Navy courier arrived with an envelope. Inside was a commendation he'd never received, one classified since the day of Echo Fire. Alongside it, a single key. No note. Just coordinates scrawled in permanent ink. Walter folded the paper, slid it into his coat, and said nothing. The next morning, he was gone. No farewell. No announcement. Locals said they saw him walking toward the marina before dawn, carrying only a duffel bag and the rusted nameplate from the Marlin. Some say he boarded a naval vessel anchored in the outer harbor. Others claim he drove inland, disappearing into the Appalachian Mountains. But no one knows for sure. All that remained was a letter left behind at the wharf's office, unsigned, but unmistakably his. It read, "The sea doesn't remember who ruled it. It remembers who respected it. Build well. Sail better. And never let laughter be louder than honor." Beneath the signature space, someone had etched a single naval star and a line drawn like a horizon. The plaque still hangs on the wall, untouched. People come from across the country to read it. Some to pay tribute. Some just to understand. But most leave in silence, standing at the edge of the rebuilt dock, watching the water that once held the wreckage of a boat and the weight of a forgotten man's legacy. And if they stay long enough, just as the wind shifts at twilight, they say you can hear it, the hum of distant turbines, the sound of a yacht being pulled away in chains, and the echo of a life that refused to be erased.